Welcome, everybody, to the official opening of E.CA's London office. It's so great to see so many familiar faces here. We're really pleased to have you all. So for those who don't know us, E.CA Economics is a consultancy specialized in antitrust, headquartered in Berlin. We have been working with many of you for quite a few years on London-based cases. So we decided to make it official and open a London office and hope to work with you some more in the future. For those who don't know me, I'm Alena Kozakova. I am co-lead here with Bas Dessens of our London office. I have both public and private experience. My public experience is from authorities in the UK and in the EU. I will not bore you with career highlights, but I will mention one, which is that I was the lead economist on the Zipcar streetcar merger inquiry. For those who remember, this was the first case in the UK when we introduced the upward pricing pressure test. And we will have later today Joe Farrell, who is of course the co-author of that particular tool. Is he? And as if on cue.
do you want us to swap?
Okay. Joe, don't worry. We are going to swap the panels. I think Joe experienced the London traffic and London taxis, which we all know are absolutely terrible. So we are going to swap over. We are going to start with the second panel first, but I will first hand over to Bas.
Thank you, Alena. You guys hear me? Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Alena. My name is Bas Dessens. I'm also director at E.CA Economics. Together with Alena, I co-lead the London office. My profile is a bit different than Alena's. I've been with E.CA Economics almost from the start, 15 years. I've been in Berlin, a bit in Brussels, now of course here in London. I spent a bit of time at the UK Competition Commission to get a bit of agency experience, but otherwise I focused in particular on consulting, and during my time at E.CA Economics I focused on big complicated merger cases and private litigation in the context of cartel and information exchange cases. So at E.CA our goal is to deliver the highest level of expertise in the field of competition economics, on the one hand through recruiting the best competition economists that we can find, but also through our network of academic experts. At ESMT, the business school in Berlin, we are affiliated with, but also at various other universities in Europe. In order to do that, it's also important to stay up to date on live topics, and therefore we have tonight organized two panels of experts to discuss such live topics, which may include challenges you face in your own practice. So tonight I will start. Alan will start. We will start actually. I will have a moderator session tonight with Lars-Hendrik and Amelia. Then we'll have an hour with the panel, some questions and a discussion, and again a break. And after that break, we'll come back and have the second session with Joe and Mike and Alena. After that, Hans and Rainer will say a couple of words, and then we invite you to the champagne reception. Okay. And now here I am. We'll start the first panel. So the first panel is about the role antitrust can or should play in achieving sustainability objectives. Leading this discussion tonight are Professor Amelia Fletcher and Lars-Hendrik Röller. So Amelia Fletcher has both an enforcement and academic background. She's a professor of competition policy at the Norwich Business School and a deputy director at the Center for Competition Policy. She's also a non-executive director on the boards of both the CMA and the FCA, and she was chief economist at the Office of Fair Trade. Further, I want to mention she was part of the hugely influential Furman Review, the UK government commissioned report on competition in digital markets. My colleague, Lars-Hendrik Röller, is also director at E.CA Economics, which he co-founded. He's a professor of economics at the ESMT, the business school I already mentioned before we are affiliated with. He was the first chief economist, and before rejoining us earlier this year, he was the chief economic advisor of the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel for more than 10 years. We chose the issue of sustainability first because it's increasingly being considered by competition authorities. Both the CMA and Nitsche Competition are looking for ways to promote it, but also because it seems too hard to deal with, using the tools that competition authorities have at their disposal. Therefore, the question arises whether relying on antitrust to achieve sustainability objectives is possible or even sensible. Yeah? So we'll discuss that tonight. First, we'll hear from Amelia, then from Hendrik. And we'll have time for questions and discussion after these first introductions. Amelia, this time you will start. The floor is yours.
So thanks, Bas, and welcome to E.CA, to the London competition community. More formally, it's good to have competition in the London competition community, so that's really good. It's great. And the title of this session was Sustainability and Antitrust Like Oil and Water. So I'll come back to that in a second. So just before I go forward, first of all, I should say I'm not on the board of the FCA anymore.
I'm sorry.
I was. I am on the board of the CMA, but in that context, I very much want to emphasize that I'm not speaking for the CMA. I'm very much speaking with my academic hat on. And I want to just absolutely start by confirming, obviously, that climate change is an issue of absolutely critical importance, and I would hope everyone in this room would share that view. And although I'm not speaking for the CMA has been very clear that it is doing a lot of work in supporting the transition to a low carbon economy. That has been and continues to be a key strategic priority. But we're here to talk about the relationship between competition policy and sustainability. And so in these initial remarks, I want to make 4 key points. And the first key point relates immediately to this oil and water point. I want to absolutely dispute the claim that competition and sustainability are at odds with each other. So in many circumstances, competition will in fact be hugely positive driving force for sustainable outcomes. So if we have consumers, individual consumers, but also business customers, if they want more sustainable products, then competitive markets will tend to be best at delivering that. If government has sustainable initiatives, such as around increasing the use of electric vehicles, competition can be well placed to deliver these within sometimes a regulatory framework, but still relying on competition. Where investors seek more sustainable investments, which is a lot, then again, we would expect competition to be very helpful in delivering those. So competition should be, in many circumstances, good for sustainability, and indeed there have been several economic studies that demonstrate that sustainability, as well as other desirable ESG objectives such as health and safety practices, are generally positively correlated with more competition. And there's recent literature surveys by a whole set of people such as Simon Holmes, Cento Valinovsky, who quite rightly also highlight the risks to sustainability from dominant firms which exhibit limited accountability and limited competitive constraint. In terms of work done by the CMA recently, they've done a market study into electric vehicle charging. And what that was about looking holistically at a very nascent market to examine how best to enable competition to deliver the charging infrastructure that we need in this country. And I'd also note that the CMA opened an antitrust case on the back of that, which related to a single firm tying up the provision of electric vehicle charging at motorway service areas, and that has since been closed, but on the basis of commitments that should open that up to more competition, hopefully driving better sustainability. So generally positive link in many circumstances. The second key point I want to make is I also dispute that competition law is a major block on sustainability initiatives. Many forms of collaboration between businesses for the achievement of sustainability goals are just unlikely to raise competition law issues or significant competition law issues. The law recognises that beneficial forms of cooperation, such as grouping together to purchase common inputs or agreeing or doing research and development joint ventures, are unlikely to harm competition, certainly providing the businesses do not jointly have market power, but potentially even if they do. And in the specific case of contestability, very often the collaboration required is effectively standard-setting collaboration. And again, there is already clear guidance that is specifically designed to enable this, so long as the anti-competitive consequences of the standard setting are minimised. So it's also worth highlighting that most competition authorities, and I can see some of my colleagues from the CMA here, and I'm sure they would agree with this, are forced to make really hard prioritisation decisions because they have limited resources and lots of big issues to address. So they typically only pursue horizontal agreements, or they only pursue anything really, but where they're hardcore or really create real harm. So they're really very unlikely to prioritise action against agreements that genuinely seek sustainable outcomes. It's also, if you could say, well, it doesn't matter whether the authorities prioritise because there's always a risk of private action. I was really racking my brain, and I'd be really interested to know if you have experience, because I know there's some people here that are involved in climate change litigation. Have you got any evidence of private action against collaboration agreements that were aimed at sustainability? I've certainly never heard of that being something that such agreements are fearful of or should be fearful of. So I actually worry, this is a lot of debate about whether these agreements are limited by competition law. Clearly there are some genuine issues, and I'll come on to that, but I do worry that a lot of the concerns in this space actually arise, and here you may have a view as well, from unduly cautious legal advice rather than genuine competition law risks. It is true that there have been examples of authorities opposing sustainability agreements, but this has typically been where the agreement went well beyond what was required for sustainability. So, for example, in 2011, the EU made a decision in the EU detergents sector. There, the Commission did not outlaw the voluntary code on producing and packaging more sustainable detergent. It actually specifically welcomed the code. The infringement decision related to a price-related agreement not to pass on certain cost savings, which was not necessary to the effectiveness of the sustainability of the code, the sustainable bit. Likewise, there's been much debate about a decision last year against BMW, Daimler and Volkswagen Group relating to their colluding to limit the development and rollout of emissions cleaning technology. But again, in that case, the Commission found that the cartel took place within what was otherwise a perfectly legal and beneficial technical cooperation. The companies were developing a new cleaning technology that used an additive to remove harmful nitrogen oxides from car exhaust. They needed to cooperate to tackle some practical challenges, for example, around the designing a standardized pump nozzle. But they crossed the line into illegal collusion when they agreed not to go any further in terms of cleaning that went beyond the level required by the legal standard. So they specifically chose not to compete for the best possible cleaning performance. Again, that wasn't necessary for the key sustainability end, and actually in this particular case, it was bad for sustainability. They were agreeing not to compete on sustainability. So these examples, I think, really highlight two important points. First, firms may wish simply to collude and to try and greenwash it, and clearly that's not good. I think more often what we may see is firms wishing to do a positive thing but discussions just very easily slipping into collusion that goes too far. But again, that we need to keep them on the focused on the good bit and not the bad bit of their agreements. So as a result, I do think it's appropriate to have quite a degree of skepticism about these cooperation agreements and whether they always lead to better outcomes. Having said that, and I mentioned this already, my third key point is, yes, I think there may be nonetheless some circumstances in which we should think about more flexibly under competition law about sustainability collaboration agreements than has arguably been in the past. Here I'm really definitely not speaking for the CMA, which is currently considering its position in this area. But I personally have long thought that the requirements under Article 101.3 or Chapter 1, whatever bit it is here, that's the bit where we basically consider whether there are sufficient efficiency benefits to justify an anti-competitive agreement. Those historically have been pretty inflexible. So they've basically said that only benefits can only be considered if those benefits go to the very consumers that are harmed by the restriction. That was the historic situation, and I did personally think that that was too restrictive, particularly in these environmental sorts of agreements. It just feels that you should be thinking about the benefits of an agreement to future consumers, to wider society. But the case precedent at EU level, at least, we haven't had any relevant cases here as far as I know, has now changed, albeit subtly, and this is reflected in the Commission's recent draft horizontal guidelines, and I broadly support that change. I also accept a really interesting point that was made recently by Roman Indurst and Stephen Thomas, that when we're thinking about doing the calculations in this space, we might want to bear in mind that people's perceptions around sustainability and therefore their willingness to pay, which is what we care about for doing the calculations, may change over time. We may start to care more about environmental harms over time than we maybe necessarily do now. And so we might want to think about that in these calculations as well. But even with those various subtle tweaks, I actually think that the number of instances where they'll make a really serious difference to the legal assessment of a collaboration agreement will be pretty limited. You'll probably all shout at me and say, oh yeah, there's millions of examples, but it's quite hard to think of too many examples. And as I say, I think competition lawyers worth their salt would already have been finding ways to enable their clients to make agreements if they genuinely enhance sustainability at the same time as minimizing unnecessary anti-competitive consequences. I also think it would have been dangerous for the Commission to go far beyond what it is proposing, because I think there is this real risk here of enabling increased greenwashing of what are basically cartels. So I'm now going to make my fourth and final key point, however, which is I think there are lots of other ways which are actually going to be much more powerful in driving action and effect on sustainability than these relatively small tweaks to competition law, even though we get all very excited about them. And on these, I personally think action is far more urgent. So first, I think we really need to, on a global basis, have much more effective, enhanced and clearer carbon pricing, general property rights around pollution, and serious enforcement of environmental law, internationally and nationally. And I think, that isn't in our domain, but that's absolutely critical. More in our domain, or maybe not everybody here's domain, but those who are involved in the CMA, this is more in our domain, because the CMA, of course, is also a consumer body. And what I think can also really help on the consumer side is better is enhanced labelling and stronger consumer law enforcement, so that where consumers do care, they can really make better choices and avoid being duped by misleading green claims. And to that end, I would just mention that the CMA has recently called for legislation, and I support this, to create, in the consumer sphere, to create standardised definitions of commonly used environmental terms to which businesses could then, if they use those terms, they have to adhere to what those terms are agreed to mean. Also, a requirement for the mandatory disclosure of certain information such as environmental impact, recyclability, repairability and durability. Legislating to require businesses to provide better environmental information to their business customers as well as their end customers. And also adding misleading or unsubstantiated environmental claims to the list of banned practices under consumer law. So I think that that's a big area, that consumer law area, that could be really impactful in the CMA. Actually, a lot of the CMA's work in this space has been in that consumer side. And then finally, I talked earlier about investors. I think what we really need, and I'm really not an expert in this, and some of you may be, but from what I've seen, I think we really need enhanced corporate social responsibility rules and enforcement in the investor sphere. There's plenty of people that want to invest in environmentally responsible firms, and this can be incredibly powerful in changing behaviour, firm behaviour. But under the current framework, I think we can see some very odd side effects. So we see firms simply contracting out their more polluting activities or putting them in other countries so that their core UK, European businesses can appear cleaner and so they can get all the ESG identified investment. So I think what we need is much better labelling of what is done, much improved due diligence on the full value chain so that investors who want to make a difference can make properly informed choices and really drive sustainability. And I would note that the EU is proposing a corporate sustainability reporting directive, which seems, and I said I'm not an expert, but it seems to do exactly this. This seems to me to be really important stuff. I would support the UK and other jurisdictions introducing similar legislation, as the problems we face, we all know they're kind of obviously global, and the impact of these sorts of initiatives must be greater if we have a globally coherent approach. So finally, and I'm probably overrunning, I'm sorry, but I just want to finish by returning to business collaboration again and highlighting that where there really is a real need for business collaboration, but also a real risk of competition problems arising, and where we also have government reluctant to regulate, which might often actually be the best solution. But if we were to have a government that seemed a bit uninclined to regulate, God forbid, then I think that what we can also do is push for government or even the competition authorities and regulators to play a convening role where they bring parties together but give them their oversight in the process. We see a bit of this happening. I haven't seen it necessarily in the environmental arena, but for example in the area of open finance, we've seen a bit of that occurring. And I think that sort of convening role by public bodies can be a good way of allowing or enabling valuable collaboration that doesn't overreach. It's that overreaching that's the problem, while allowing government to avoid imposing the legislation that they don't want to impose. So I will finish there, and thank you very much.
No, thank you, Amelia. If you have any questions, please hold them. We'll now first hear from Lars-Hendrik, and then that will open the floor for questions and discussion.
Thank you very much. I don't think we're going to disagree on a lot of things, but first I want to say I'm very happy to be here. I was also co-founding E.CA 15 years ago after having been first chief economist, and I'm very proud of the development of E.CA, especially Hans and Rainer, who have been taking it up, and very happy also now that we have an office in London. And speaking sort of, while Queen Elizabeth is looking at me, I think that's her up there. That's, E.CA, Queen Elizabeth is quite a phenomenal thing. I was going to end up with that, but I think also, having been in government for the last 10 years and really worrying about climate and coordinating international climate action and the sustainability discussion we're having on ESR, which is not only environment but also social and responsibility. So when I looked at, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the guidelines, the draft guidelines of the European Commission, I don't know what the CMA is doing, to be very open about that. I was thinking, what the hell does competition policy have to do with all of that? And this is, I think, one of your main points at the end. I think, we've been working on, on the price. I think there are basically 4 policies trying to get, and most of it is actually an international problem, because the climate issue is not a German problem, it's not a European issue, it's a global problem. So the rest of the world on board. But we can, of course, do it by developing technology and then transferring the technology. That's another big step towards the rest of the world, which is not happening. So that argument is okay. So I think it's important, and I think we had 4 levers, sort of building on what you said. I think the first one is the CO2 pricing. I mean, that is sort of the silver bullet, but progress there is weak. I think the Commission is trying to do a little more in that area. Germany, in its wisdom, energy, is trying to do a little bit more. But global pricing is very difficult. The US is a very special case. And we have in the G7 the climate club. So I think the CO2 pricing is really the silver bullet. And once you've got CO2 pricing, in place, many of these other issues wouldn't occur, I think. Not having this thought through all the way into competition policy. The second one, of course, is regulation. Very important. Perceived fairness, because rich and poor are affected the same way. Not economically efficient, but if you think about market failures and you think about internal decisions by firms, relates to your finance point. Having sort of in 2045 no more combustible engines, I was always against that, coming from Germany with the automobile industry. But of course, it gives a signal also inside the firm, and there are different things happen. If you look at the economics of how firms make their decisions, there are different fractions inside each firm. I think it's actually an important thing, and we should do more. Consumer protection is another famous example. I'm less strong on the consumer protection side for reasons one can discuss. The third one are sort of government programs and government funding. Gets you into the question of how much public money do you want to spend into it. And there we're doing a lot of stupid things, I can say that now. But it's also very important, for example, building the grid and building the infrastructure for electric mobility. I mean, that's really key. And making it European in the case of Europe. And in the US, actually, there's a lot of things happening. I think it's not at the federal level, it's at the state level. You look at the CO2 in the US, actually looks much better than with us here, but we of course have also a very special situation right now with the last 6 months. So that's the third one. The fourth one is the financial markets. And there I think the greenwashing, the standards, they're working on new accountancy rules. The new board is actually in Frankfurt. We fought very hard to get this into Frankfurt. And there's SEC regulation coming up, and there's the EU regulation coming up. Fundamental, because I think allocating private capital is important, just like the first one, the pricing. But there's of course also the argument that, and there's a big discussion in the US with Texas and with Trump states, which are criticizing that, funds allocate money more towards ESG types of activities because it's none of their business. It's politics, but not good economics. There's also a question, how effective is this? Because when you buy a green bond or a green stock, there's somebody who sells and somebody who buys it, and to really have an effect in the market, you need to actually change the strategy of a firm, so otherwise it's just financially neutral. It's a big, Chicago school, if you want arguments from the finance guys. And I believe that. So really and I'm digressing a little bit from that, I come to the EU guidelines in a second. But what you need is actually not only put the money there, but also what some companies call stewardship, which actually, or in German we used to call the Hausbankprinzip, where the banks actually, and there's bank and non-banking sector is another big issue, actually impose their will or their advice on companies to actually do certain things because the investor wants to do that. And that you really need, I think, intellectually to argue that the financial market in fact has an impact on the environment. So I think all those four things are fundamental, and much more important than I think what we do in competition policy with all due. I'm sort of speaking against our own business model here, but I think those issues are important. Now specifically to the guidelines, and I looked at the guidelines. I think clearly, I've told this also to Pierre Régibaud and others, there's a lot of political pressure in Brussels on the commissioner to do something about sustainability. The commission is about sustainability and digitalization, so every commissioner has to deliver on sustainability. And I think that's fair, but I think there's a lot of political economy behind setting up these guidelines. And I don't know who would not be in favor of doing this. I think that the government wants to say we do something on sustainability. The enforcers, I've listened to enforcers who are very happy to broaden their perspective. In my country, I think this is the case. And the firms, I think, are sort of ambivalent. I think I think people like you might be very critical. I'm also very critical, but the political economy is that let's introduce sustainability also in competition policy. But that's not an argument in itself. It's just something where I get very nervous about because I've seen it happening in many other areas, in trade, where trade is being overloaded with all kinds of things, and other areas as well. So now here we want to do good things in competition policy on this, which is fine. Now when you look at the Commission's paper, I don't have all the experience with you in the CMA, in paragraph 543, they say what this is. So they say it encompasses activities that support economic, environmental, social, including labor and human rights, developments. And then again, they talk about human rights several times and also ensuring animal welfare. I think there has been a case in the Netherlands on that. Boy. Okay. The only thing which is not there, if the guidelines had been written 6 months later, I would guarantee you biodiversity would have also been, but that's the hottest topic right now because there's a link between, there's a big UN summit coming up in a month in Montreal, the link between biodiversity and COVID, because if you reduce the number of species, you have much more viruses, and there's a lot of academic and scientific research on that. And there's also a link, of course, between biodiversity and CO2. If you think about deforestation in the Amazon, that's biodiversity. So it's not there. So the Commission hasn't thought of biodiversity, but I think that's a big policy issue, by the way. So everything. I don't know. And my conclusion is going to be the proof of the pudding is in the eating, so let's see how the whole thing gets applied. But I find that not a good thing, what they say here, all these things. I mean, I'm for human rights, but I don't think that competition policy is the right instrument. We've been fighting over human rights all the time, for all kinds of reasons. I remember the discussion we've been having on labor markets. Should labor be, in South Africa, with all its, I was there helping them to set up their competition policy law with Damien Nevin, actually, it was down there. I think it was 99, with their traditional labor union approach, and in their competition law, they look at mergers, they look at the effects on the labor market. We try to, no, don't do that, competition policy is only there. We're looking at competition, not labor markets. The theory is sort of Tinbergen, the Tinbergen theory, look at one instrument for one policy, but of course for politicians that's very hard. And I'm a big orthodox guy. I think we should not do all kinds of things. So then specifically, but it's very broad, at least in principle, but they tell me, don't worry, we're not going to look at human rights. Pierre was saying that, for example, in the margins of the conference. So and that also raises the issue, how broad should the mandate be in competition policy? This is also true in central banks, for example. Not a topic for here, but there's a big discussion of the mandate, and I'm a big fan of just like Bernard Couéret, actually, who's now the competition in France. I like him, he comes from central banks. Let's not do everything with competition policy. And he says, of course, the mandate, there's a struggle over what the mandate of the central banks should be in Europe. It's sort of stability, price stability. It's being debated also. But, you know, and independence. And this is also, I think, what antitrust is. And if you do that, I think it's an advantage we have in our economies if you have these kinds of things. If you don't do that, if you're willing to do everything, and you know that, then, you know, with respect to 101, of course, you are willing to, you know, look at things which restrict competition. So you're sacrificing competition, and then you look at all the benefits, okay? And I'm with you on that. I think we should be very conservative on that one, because, you know, you reduce competition. And I think so the first one is that takes away that logic, which and Verstager, by the way, she said recently herself, when somebody, I think it was the Dutch competition policy person who said we should be more flexible, you know, the environment is important, these guys should be able to coordinate. She actually had a public statement, I read that today, which says, no, it's about competition, and you know, it's not like oil and water. I would say it's like oil and gas. These are two different things, but as a German, I shouldn't talk about gas. So I think that's point number one, that I think that's the Verstager point. The second problem is, do we have the expertise in competition agencies to look at these things? You know, I know we're smart and we're good and we know how to analyze markets, but there are a lot of smart people out there who look at an environment, and you have to be good at that. Now, of course, we can hire people, which is, I guess, what the agencies like. That was a joke, but do we have the expertise? The other one is measurability. You know, in this sustainability literature on financial markets and also biodiversity, how do you measure the big question is, how do you measure it? And if you can't measure it, you know, in most other areas of politics, if you can't measure it, it becomes very arbitrary. So I'm a big fan of data measuring, and I wonder, how are you going to measure human rights? You know, if you're really serious about what's in the guidelines, maybe they are not. Maybe it's just there for the politicians, that we do something about human rights. This is kind of what I'm hoping for, that nobody takes this very seriously, what's in these guidelines. But then you don't know. You also don't know, you know, you have a commission right now, you don't know what the next one is going to do. So these guidelines are, you know, the DNA of the agency, I think. The other one is this the best instrument, this indispensability? And I will expand a little bit on that. Anyways, I think those are all the problems as to why I would be very conservative on looking at too many other things except something you know. And I think that has happened in areas of trade. Trade policy has been weakened, I think, in Europe because, you know, it's environment, sustainability, and trade. You know, President Macron very strong on that, and it's difficult. Do we just trade, or do we also care about the environment? And intellectually, of course, these two things are together. But the question is, how much? Now, specifically, therefore, I would take these guidelines very restrictively, for maybe different reasons than you said, but we come up with the same conclusion. You don't think there is maybe such a big trade-off between competition, and I think I don't know, and I can't measure the benefits, and I'm afraid this is going to potentially be abused if you don't do it in a proper way. And the indispensability, of course, is a big issue in all areas, in state aid, and this is a fundamental principle of economics. Is there an alternative, better way which doesn't restrict competition? So it's the fundamental trait of competition policy: restriction, benefits. That's one. And I think there are, and this goes back to the other ones. I don't want to repeat here, but you have CO2 price. So I think normally what we do, correct me if I'm wrong, when you look at antitrust cases, you look at the indispensability of agreements only at potentially other types of agreements the firm could engage in. So it's a rather, we don't look at the rest of the world. Here, I think that's the wrong question. I think the indispensability should also look at other better CO2 pricing. Now, if you don't want to do that because it's not happening, then, of course, you soften the approach. But I think that is something which I would propagate. But I don't think the Commission is thinking that way. Pierre has said that it's only looking at agreements. We're not looking at policy, but I think this is fundamentally wrong. I mean, as an economist or as paragraph 584 talks about free riding. So this is the inverse argument, the first mover disadvantages. I think you can write down economic models where it's a disadvantage to go first. There are also ways to deal with that through other kinds of things, intellectual property and other ways of doing it. But I think that argument there is a good one. Paragraph 585 talks about scale. You need to have enough scale. That has nothing to do with sustainability. We talk about it. You don't need the guidelines for telling me there's scale in all of that, so I don't understand. Paragraph 586 talks about lack of knowledge and information of the consumers. So you can say, well, let's do consumer protection if you believe in that. No reason really to restrict competition, okay? And so on. So I think, my argument would be, let's look at this, but maybe I've been looking at different things for too long, but I think really the problem is somewhere else, and it's not, we don't need to restrict competition to get these things, is my thing. The other argument is the consumer pass-on. There's some people here know more about this than I do, and normally the tradition has always been, we look at pass-on within the market, that the consumer has to be compensated. And here, in the guidelines, they say, again, the balancing of the pass-on with the consumer normally is within the relevant market. So normally, it is the way it is before, but then there's this collective benefits. They define these things of collective benefits. So this is somewhere else. And then they say that the consumer who is subject to restriction of competition has to be an overlap between that person and the person who gets the benefit. So if you are you're subject to less restricting competition, but you're also getting clean air, it's the same person, and therefore they would take that into account. And they also say that if that's not the case, if it's not an overlap in the consumer, that's what they say, then there has to be, to consumers who are outside the relevant market, it has to be a relatively large benefit. So I think that's what, so I interpret that, given the subject, which is externalities in the environment, which is huge, it's softening the traditional approach, but it's still rather conservative in a way. It makes the hurdle very high. So if you're really serious about environment, you should be much more looking at the externalities outside the market, but they're trying to limit that. So I like that. So I like their approach to pass on, if you read the guidelines. On the indispensability, I would interpret it much broader in order to make it a bit more restrictive one, because I think that, for the reasons I mentioned, that I think this should be limited. So in conclusio, I think I think you have to be very careful with the political economy of all of that, and I think we want to protect antitrust and competition policy and looking at competition. Expanding the mandate is something which I think goes, by the way, also in other areas of competition. You've got digital markets, you also expand what competition looks at, and probably there it's necessary to do that. You're working a lot in this area. I think on indispensability and pass-on, we should take a restrictive approach and limit the guidelines to maybe obvious cases, because the Commission is going to do that. So let's do it in a rather conservative way. The proof of the pudding in all of that is in the eating. This was the favorite quote of Chancellor Merkel. Shows that the proof of the pudding is something in English you knew. Proof of the pudding is in the eating, and I think also the role of the courts are going to be very important. By the way, that's also what the Dutch, forgot his name, the head of the Dutch.
Snoep?
Yeah, that guy. Person.
Sorry.
important person, that he said that ultimately the courts are going to decide that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you. Maybe I'll summarize briefly the main points we just heard, and then open the floor to questions and discussion. So Amelia made 4 key points. One, competition and sustainability are not at odds with each other. Competition law is not a major block on sustainability initiatives, but there may still be circumstances with a need to be more flexible about sustainability agreements than we have in the past. And the 4th point, there are various other more powerful ways to drive sustainability, enhanced and clear property rights, and environmental law enforcement, enhanced labeling, stronger consumer law enforcement, and enhanced corporate social responsibility rules. Lars-Hendrik voiced a bit of skepticism on
I think they heard what I said.
the draft horizontal guidelines. It includes now a lot of things that are not typically in the realm of competition policy. We need to be careful expanding the role of the competition authorities, but once it is expanded, we now need to be restrictive in applying it and focus on areas where it's necessary. Not only if there's true gains to be made, we need to focus on indispensability, it is required, and pass on. What is the benefit to the market? And also the question, what is the market to consider? In the market, or also those out of the market benefits. Thank you very much. Yeah. Are there any questions to the panelists? Yes, please. Have you have a microphone for the audience?
By the way, we can't really see you.
Yeah, we're blinded by the light, but I saw some hands
Blinded
going up.
by the light.
Yeah.
I can see Queen Elizabeth, but no.
There's a microphone coming. Give 1 second.
She has
Yeah.
no questions to ask at
She
this
has no
point.
question.
Well, I think it's probably okay.
Yeah, actually, yes.
So you put down the gauntlet, right? Give us an agreement that was blocked, or that is. I have a list of 15 agreements I've met over the last 5 years, or 4 years, which are given to the CMA. Although, of course, not identifying terms. And so they range between the clearly permissible, and you're right, many of them, like standardization, are permissible, and the grey zone and the clearly impermissible. And it's the grey zone we argue about. Now, let's mention an agreement which recently appeared in the Financial Times several times, which are these net zero alliances. Right? Mark Carney, the former central bank in the UK, at COP27, set up these net zero alliances like net zero insurance, net zero asset managers, net zero finance, net zero banking, and so on. And the idea is that these companies commit to achieve net zero in 2050. But they have gone a little bit further. They have listened to the International Energy Agency, which says that if we want to meet the Paris Agreement goals, there must be no new unabated coal power plants anywhere in the world. Right? So they said, let's agree not to have new unabated coal projects in the world. This is, right? And this comes from the International Energy Agency. Unfortunately, it now appears that even if there are no new unabated coal projects in the world, we are still going to miss the Paris Agreement goals because the existing emissions are too bad. But nonetheless, that was an agreement. And what happened in the US, and to an extent in Europe, but mostly in the US, a number of antitrust lawyers says that this is a cartel, this is a collective boycott, we can't do this, and so forth. Now, this to me is a pretty good example of a very useful agreement which is being blocked by competition law. And why is it a problem? Why is competition law a problem here? Because there are externalities. There are market failures here. If I'm an insurance company, right, and I'm going to insure Bas's coal power plant, I'm going to look at the physical risk associated with that coal power plant, and I'm going to set a fee which reflects that. But what I do not include in my price and my fee to him and my premium to him is the damage that I impose on you and everybody else because of the emissions. So, and now you are also going to insure, you're also an insurance company, you're also going to insure another coal power plant, like let's say Lars-Hendrik's coal power plant. So you are going to impose a fee on him which reflects his physical risk, but not the cost on everybody else. So the social cost is an externality. And that's a market failure, because it would be in everybody's interest, including yours and yours, if you did not impose the cost on each other, and that climate change is abated, physical risk to each other's plants are reduced, and physical risk and climate change risk to society is reduced. So this is a perfect example of market failure, I think. Now you would say regulation, carbon trading, taxation, emissions trading rights, where is it? There is not just a market failure, there is also a regulatory failure. And it's worldwide. So I'll finish in a moment, if I may, because this is really, really important, right? So there's a regulatory failure, there is a market failure, and how do you solve collection action problems with coordination? And if coordination has to come from the private sector because the public sector doesn't do its job, then it's better to allow that than not to allow that. Now I could go on, but I won't. But so to me, market failures and regulatory failures really call for private action cooperation.
Any response to that?
Yeah, this is a famous case. I think Mark Carney is in trouble because of that, especially because of the US. Of course, that's also politically motivated in the US because it's by the industry, the oil and gas industry is trying to unearth this global finance on this E-funds, it's called, which is part of the UN. And it's been very, and he's renegotiating that right now because some of the banks have actually also said they're getting out of it, which is a problem for him. And I think you summarize it well. I think there's you would solve that problem if you had proper CO2 pricing, but you would say, I would still say that's what we need to do. And I think pressure, and we need to move in that direction, but you're saying it's not happening. So let's do something like that, like having a restriction on phasing out coal. Maybe that's an example where one can look at, because we didn't say none of it. But I would still argue, is that agreement really necessary to arrive at 250 carbon neutral? Just because the International Energy Agency, which is also a regulatory body that like to regulate things, and actually in the G20 we already have a commitment of most of the countries have said no new unabated power plants. So basically, I think they are also. I'm sympathetic with your view because I think we've been fighting for phasing out coal. We pay a lot of money in Germany, by the way, for doing that. And now we're putting it back into the market. But I think if I was Mark Carney who's redesigning the thing, I would just think about individual commitments of companies of achieving carbon neutrality. I think that's very important, rather than this collective one. But but it might be that this is an exception. You seem to have worked a lot in that area. Are you Moritz Dolmans?
Yes.
That might be a good idea where we should allow that agreement for happening.
Okay.
But he's changing it now because there is this threat of antitrust in the US, but it's all politically motivated, by the way. It's not that environmentalists are challenging, it's the big oil and gas industry.
Okay. Thank you.
Are you working for that?
Let's have it we'll have a break in a second, and we can talk about it. We have some more questions there. Maybe. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I think you were first. Apologies.
Hi, thank you. James Webber from Sherman. A question really for Lars-Hendrik. You've mentioned a few times about politics and the political power that's driving the guidance. Yeah. And I often think that is there any true sort of intellectual honesty sort of inside comp, right? Because you've got the idea that competition policy has a fairly marginal role to play in terms of sustainability. Merits obviously has examples where that might not be the case. But the other element of DG Comp's role in terms of state aid and subsidy approval, we're seeing enormous, historically unprecedented levels of industrial subsidisation for important projects of common European interest, E.CAs, to move industrial production of hydrogen, steel, or battery production to the European Union.
Right.
And I wonder, and I work in some of these projects, whether actually the most sustainable outcome is that steel is produced where the renewable power can be generated, North Africa, Western Australia, etc., rather than transmitted through hydrogen to the EU where the traditional industrial base was. And I really think, the transmission loss of energy density between renewable electricity to produce hydrogen, to transport that hydrogen to Europe, to convert it back, and then turn it into steel are immense. And yet, there doesn't seem to be any flavour of that in terms of how the Commission is approving this subsidisation of hydrogen steel. And you think the true sustainability hat would be, no, we will buy the green products from the place in the world that has access to the most efficient renewable energy. And it's an unfair question because you're not in the Commission. But I wonder whether you have any sympathy for that view and any reflections given your previous role on the political consequences.
Yeah, well, I was always these important projects of common European interest. That's our flagship industrial policy program in Europe. We think everybody else is doing a lot of industrial policy, including the United States and China, and therefore we relax the state aid rules. But it's really an industrial policy argument. But of course, when we have two on chips, we have one on hydrogen, we're building one on hydrogen, we have one on electric mobility, as you mentioned, we're doing one on health. So it's not all environment, but it's important areas. But with regard to the environment, I guess you could argue the same thing. So I think we should be careful there as well in terms of relaxing the state aid rules, because again, you have that trade-off between distorting competition to creating important industrial policies in Europe. Right, so I think this is the same thing where we should be careful, and I know that a lot of people are worried. There's also in state aid, I don't want to talk too long, in state aid this problem that Germany has a lot of money. This is now the new energy discussion we're having on the 200 million program. And Hans knows this all very well, these arguments, sort of that Germany is sort of unfairly subsidizing its industry. The important projects of common European interests, of course, are one where many countries have to come together. So I was always very positive on it, but you're right, there's exactly the same kind of trade-off there, and we need to be careful to go further. But I also think this is not environment, this is sort of having key technologies in Europe there I don't really see an alternative, better instrument like E.CA than many of the environmental things. So the industrial policy, we need to make sure that in Europe we have some of that. But you're right, intellectually it's a similar argument.
Thank you. We had another question in the back, I think. Yes.
Sure.
Tommaso.
Tommaso.
Hi,
Tommaso.
You were the first chief economist, I was the fifth chief economist.
You see?
Time flies.
Goes better over time.
Slightly different take. So I want to elaborate on your political economy, but political economy of antitrust.
Yes. Yes.
So what's been happening in the past 5 years is that there is quite a big movement out there which is criticizing the way we've been under-enforcing antitrust.
Right.
And calling for a tightening
in digital markets.
Intervention, and I certainly include myself in that movement. Some people belonging to the antitrust establishment are freaking out. They don't like this call for more antitrust intervention. They're going the opposite direction. And now when the environment comes, that's exactly what you need to push back that movement and perhaps go in the opposite direction. So let's think as economists, whether they have any arguments to those which are pushing back. Because we hear about externalities, market failures, but also lack of competition is actually a market failure, and that's why we intervening in markets to start with, and that's the starting point of antitrust enforcement. So let's be more precise. So there can be negative externalities, pollution, we have too much. How do we deal with that? We deal with that typically with carbon taxes. Could we deal with that with antitrust enforcement? Yes, we could allow a merger to monopoly among the tobacco manufacturers so that the price of cigarettes become more expensive. But that's not the argument these people are making to push back. They will never say that. No, we want to be seen as good guys. Obviously that argument is without any merit, because we do want the partners of health state and not as profits of the company. So that argument doesn't have any bearing on relaxing antitrust enforcement, which in my view is particularly tight. Other argument could be then, therefore, positive externalities. Positive externalities typically mean that there is not enough consumption of good things. Okay? We would like people to adopt more of certain solutions. But if we want people to adopt more of certain solutions, we want prices to be low, right? Otherwise, people don't adopt it. So, how on earth can relaxing antitrust and relaxing competition policy help even in that direction? So the last argument, which is, so it doesn't work. Intellectually, it's, I mean, people immediately come with strange examples. We have to borrow arguments from the US because we cannot find a good one in Europe. The evidence there in Europe, and you, Amelia, for mentioning, actually ran that case with the cartel that was the German car manufacturer that were actually deciding not to compete in terms of reducing emissions for diesel cars, and that's the evidence which is in front of us. So this idea that firms would love to do amazing solutions for society, but they cannot implement those solutions because they are so fearful that there is these bad regulators, these bad antitrust enforcers which are out there planning to block everything that moves. I mean, that's not a reflection of reality. So there is one argument which could be investment and spillovers. Okay? So you don't invest enough because there are positive spillovers on your competitors, hence competition doesn't work. But we have a set of guidelines for R&D joint ventures for that. So I rest my case. I don't see any argument which is a possible argument, despite being a very open-minded person. I don't see on the economics point of view any argument for relaxing competition policy whatsoever.
Thank you, Tommaso. Any response to that from the panel?
So I'd just like to say I talked in my when I was trying to give a very measured view, but I think there are. But I equally didn't maybe emphasise the importance of competition law in limiting market power. And I did start by saying that market power, or at least competition and sustainability, are for the most part aligned, and therefore limiting market power is for the most part aligned with sustainability. And therefore I actually think that all of the abusive dominance stuff, it fits with exactly what you're saying. If we're weak on abusive dominance, we're going to actually be weak on sustainability. If we let anti-competitive mergers through, we're actually going to be letting mergers through that are bad for sustainability. So I basically somewhat agree with Tommaso.
Hendrik, anything to say?
No, if I understood it correctly, you're saying here's an area where we might be over-enforcing because of this, taking it. Where's Tommaso? No, I don't.
There, yeah.
He's worried about under-enforcement. Yeah, okay, but I'm worried about over-enforcement. Okay. But there are other areas like in digital markets, which is something which is very popular nowadays, where, that it seems to be like we're worried about having under-enforced. And the DMA, if I may say that, when I was switching topics with this Digital Markets Act, I think in the US there's also a big debate on that, is now going in another way. And it'd be interesting to see where the economics is in all of that, because I still believe that solid economics, robust economics, simple economics is important in making right decisions. It's not making things more complicated. That's a discussion we've had already 10 years ago. And I think that's necessary. And I think there has been politically motivated, if I may say so, maybe not, this doesn't work. Maybe not only politically, but also the facts are quite clear, because you've got these large concentrations, on the two-sided markets and the gatekeeper function. That we're now going in a more enforcement regime. And I think I can't argue that's wrong. I still think there should be room for economics, and I think that's the discussion we're having right now on these Articles 5 and 6 and the implementation of that. But I do think that in terms of antitrust, under-enforcement, over-enforcement, that given that we're switching sort of regimes in those markets, that we should do some kind of ex-ante evaluation of our policies. I think that's very important. There's a lot of research on going the other way. I was obviously part of what in Europe they call this more economic approach, which we started Europe sort of 10 or 15 years ago, which introduced also a lot of economic analysis in, I think, making good decisions, and I still believe that's very important. And now we're going the other way, maybe, but I think we need to do some ex post evaluation of these things. Amelia, what do you think about
So what I was going to say is, this is slightly off topic, but I think that there is a link between what you were just saying and what Tommaso was saying. Is I think there is a really interesting question about whether the focus on measurability actually led to some of the under-enforcement, because it can be so hard to prove your case to the nth degree. I think that actually what the economists did is slightly put their eye very firmly on empirical economics and slightly took their eye off the ball of theoretical economics, so that they found themselves having to prove that like a 2-to-1 merger was bad. No, you don't need to prove that. That's your presumption. And you can maybe come up with some other evidence that goes the other way, but you really need to put theory at the heart. I think Joe did a very brilliant thing with the guppy stuff and the up stuff, of coming up with some simple things that actually allowed us to start doing empirical analysis in a way that started redressing the balance. But I do think that I'm afraid, that there's a link between what you were saying and what Tommaso was saying there.
Okay. Thank you very much for all of you, the panelists for their contributions, the questions from the audience. I think we had a great debate. Would like now to bring this to a close. We'll have another short break of about 15 minutes for some more drinks and a snack, and then we'll come back for the second.
Welcome to the second panel, and I have two esteemed panelists with me to discuss the subject of polarization of antitrust. This was meant to be our first panel, and you have already heard some of the points that we know are going to be raised again in this second panel. So why did we want to talk about polarization of antitrust? It would seem that depending on who you talk to, there is either criminal over-enforcement of antitrust or criminal under-enforcement of antitrust. Vertical mergers are either completely benign or as bad as horizontal mergers. And Chapter 2 or Article 102 is either completely broken or doing just fine. So I have two panelists who are going to try and make some sense out of the current situation for us. Mike Walker and Joe Farrell. So Joe, as you all know, apart from being a Bates White partner, it also has the triple accolade of being the former chief economist of the FTC, DOJ, and FCC. I mean, it's quite unusual. And he's also an esteemed academic at University of California, Berkeley. Mike Walker, who you all know, is a former consultant and currently the chief economist at the Competition and Markets Authority. Obviously also an academic at King's College and Collège de Bruges. And I wonder whether there's anyone in this room who hasn't read his book, Economics of Competition Law, of EU Competition Law. I have actually 2 editions at home. So, without further ado, I will hand over first to Joe and then to Mike.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very relieved to be here at last. As Alena mentioned, I used to be in telecom more, and in telecom, all the problems stem from the last mile. I had a very smooth journey from California to London, and then not so smooth from the hotel to here tonight. So my sincere apologies again for that, and here I am. Let's see, do we have a clicker for the slides or something?
Yes.
Yes.
Last mile, talking of the last mile. Joe.
Yes. So I'm going to skip over the first couple of slides, actually, and just comment a little bit on some aspect of the alleged polarization of antitrust. I don't think there's as much polarization as people sometimes suggest, but I do think there's an interesting way out of polarization that seems not to be working. And what I want to do this evening is to explore a little bit why it seems not to be working, and in particular not to be working for the more pro-enforcement side. There's an asymmetry there that I don't entirely understand and that I think is wrong. So just to lay some of my cards on the table here, what I'll be saying this evening, I do agree with some of those in the polarization debate that we probably do need more antitrust enforcement, or at least that many of the cases where we see antitrust enforcement fail to be tried, I use that phrase rather than failing, it's a mistake. And why does that mistake go on happening? That's my question, really. And then a related question is doing more. Some people, perhaps particularly in the US, the pro-enforcement side of some of the current debates, have become a little fed up or frustrated with detailed economic analysis. And it's not obvious to me why that should be true. And that's part of what I'm going to be talking about. Specifically, if we take a decision theory perspective, then I think it is rather puzzling how you can have what is perceived to be an unduly cautious policy, but the advocates of a more vigorous policy not wanting to pursue it through detailed economic analysis, wanting instead to have relatively simple rules. I do think, though, that some simple rules or presumptions, as Amelia was saying just before the break, I think that some simple rules or presumptions, largely common sense in terms of competition economics, would help. And at the end of my remarks, I'll suggest some places where we might have them. I've not really tried to phrase them carefully because this is not the occasion to try to rewrite the competition statutes, I don't think. It's more a question of giving some idea of what we might mean by simple rules. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about decision theory, or about antitrust polarization in the lens of decision theory. And just for those of you who are not used to thinking about these things in quite the way that economists naturally tend to, I'm going to be using a simplified decision theory mental model. I call it a mental model because I don't think I'm going to be substantively relying on what I'm about to say, but the phrasing and the way that I say things and think about things do rely on this. I'm going to assume that in each case or investigation, intervention is either beneficial or harmful, okay? And everyone, initially at least, is uncertain which of those two states of the world or circumstances prevails. And decision theory is based on the idea that you can represent your beliefs by a probability of this versus that. And you compare that then against some threshold probability. If the probability is higher than the threshold probability, you should intervene. If the probability is lower than the threshold, you should refrain from intervening. That threshold depends on the payoffs, or sometimes people say the loss functions, and it depends on the a priori frequencies of meritorious intervention. And nobody knows really what those a priori frequencies are or what the loss functions are. We don't have big population studies that give us a very clear sense of that. And so there's a lot of subjective disagreement, and it's hard to convince your opponents because their views, mistaken though you might think them to be, are not easily disprovable, and your views, correct though they undoubtedly are not easily provable. Okay? So we have a disagreement about the probability or about the threshold or both. And those disagreements tend to be rather stubborn because it's difficult to see in practice how you can really adduce a lot of evidence. It's much easier to look at evidence in a particular case. Okay, so I sort of said all this. I'm going to give this the title Vigor. We want to have a more vigorous competition policy, which is to say, let's lower the threshold and let's assert that the probabilities of intervention being beneficial are higher than some people might think. Let's just do more, okay? So we can do more through vigor, arguing that threshold should be lower, arguing that intervention is likely to be justified, but we run up against these sort of stubborn and hard to reverse disagreements. So an alternative thing you can do is to use rigor. I'm using the English spelling, by the way. You know the American spelling lacks the U's. So more information. More information generically always helps in an optimal decision problem. Okay, and so that's the standard economic argument for getting more information. But there's another benefit too that has to do with rhetoric and persuasion here, rather than with optimal decisions, and that's the following. More information can dissolve disagreement if the disagreement focuses on the threshold, because the threshold doesn't really matter if you can accumulate enough information that your posterior probability shifts almost all the way to either probability 0 or probability 100%, one way or the other. It doesn't matter how likely you think mergers are to be harmful if you can see that this merger is harmful. It doesn't matter how likely you think vertical restraints are to be harmful if you can see that this vertical restraint is not harmful. And so one way to dissolve or bypass the stubborn disagreement that I was just talking about would be to do a lot of case-specific investigation. Okay? So fact-specific or detailed investigation of a particular case or a particular class of cases ought to be a way out of the stubborn disagreements that I think are at the heart of a lot of polarization of antitrust. And yet, it seems like one side, the pro-enforcement side, is very reluctant to recommend more economics, more fact-specific investigation, more analytical rigor. Instead, they think that that's been a trap, that it's led to paralysis, that it's led to people not being willing to intervene in a way that doesn't make a lot of sense in the decision theory framework that I'm talking about. Okay? So what's gone wrong with that? Well, apparently, they believe, and I think we should take the belief seriously, that this is not an optimal decision problem or anything close to it, and that more information, instead of leading to a better decision, not necessarily optimal, but better, it has harmful consequences for decision making. You make better decisions if you ask a very naive question, like, are all horizontal mergers harmful, than you do by investigating in detail this particular merger. Okay? So, analytical question for us, in what ways and in what circumstances can that be true? Can it be actually harmful to your decision making to have more information? Okay? So how can more information hurt? Well, one thing that comes naturally to an economist's mind is if the decision maker is inappropriately motivated. Okay? So if the decision maker is trying to subvert antitrust or has been bribed or I don't know what, right? So if you have a very non-optimal decision maker with bad incentives, more information can help pursue those bad incentives and therefore lead to worse decisions. But I really don't think that's what's going on here. Maybe I'm naive, but I don't think that's what's going on. I think it's a combination of a number of other ways in which more information or detailed investigation can lead to worse decisions. So here's a few. Okay? One thing is if you have a very detailed idea of how much evidence there is in a particular case, you can sort of compare that against other cases you've seen. And one thing you might do with that information is to say, well, that's a significant amount of evidence, but it's not as much as the evidence that I've seen in successful cases for intervention previously. Okay? So it's less convincing than the average convincing case that I've seen. Well, if you think about it, that's a recipe for a ratchet effect, because with any stable threshold for intervention, you're going to have to intervene in some cases that are less convincing than the average case that's convincing. Okay? So if you insist on things being at least comparable with the average successful case, you get a ratchet effect. This ratchet effect was first explained to me by a CEO compensation consultant who said that he thought what was going on with CEO compensation was that every board of directors wanted their CEO to be rewarded at least at the average level of CEO compensation. And we did, in fact, see a dramatic ratchet effect in CEO compensation. Another thing that might be going on is certain kinds of evidence, in particular negative kinds of evidence, might be getting overweighted, right? And I think this is probably part of what's going on, too. There's a phrase, merchants of doubt, which has been used in largely non-antitrust contexts to refer to the following. You can have respectable scientists raising legitimate questions that raise some doubt about what people think is true. Okay? And in some circumstances, it's not obvious to me what those circumstances are, but I think it does happen, the doubts to which the proper response will be, yeah, good point, that's an uncertainty. Even so, the overall case is convincing, we should go ahead. That might be the proper response in some circumstances, but instead we get to paralysis that people say, well, we really don't know, so we better not do anything. That last "so" is not really, it's not a legitimate syllogism, right? If we really don't know, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything. But there's a pattern of thought under which that's true. Another way in which more information and more detailed information about economic competitive consequences can lead to worse decisions is, and this is sort of a mechanism for the merchant of doubt effect, but I like to distinguish it a little bit. There are a number of dimensions on which markets can differ in their competitiveness or their openness to competition or their efficiency, okay? And suppose you see a body of evidence that says this one's troubling, that one's sort of in between, this one looks pretty good. How do you combine those things, okay? I think the economics generally tells you that to get a good competitive outcome, you need a variety of things to go right. But someone who's not an economic specialist, or in some circumstances this may even be right, might say, well, if some things are going right and other things are wrong, things could be worse, not so bad, no need to intervene. So in the theory of competition economics, contestability and easy entry played a role where some economists were arguing that as long as you have that, it doesn't matter what else is wrong with the market. Okay? That theory, I think, has been convincingly disproven, but the idea that something going right can make up for things that go wrong is a possible way in which this more information might lead to worse decisions. And then let me also mention what David Gelfand from the Justice Department a few years ago at a Bates White conference called the CSI effect. The CSI effect is so named after a television program about forensic evidence on crime scenes. And a number of criminal lawyers, criminal defense and prosecution lawyers, believe that juries have become accustomed to the idea that if I did the murder, you're going to find my DNA and fingerprints and so on everywhere. And therefore, if you don't have that kind of evidence, I should be acquitted, right? And it might be that there are other bodies of evidence that would be enough to convict me, but juries don't believe that, having watched a lot of CSI, okay? So the CSI effect, according to David Gelfand, is if you don't have a precise merger simulation, then you don't really have a case. Because merger simulation might be a very compelling kind of evidence that is sometimes available, and the CSI effect is the decision maker assumes that it's always available when you have a meritorious case. That's not true, so you get an anti-enforcement bias. So the obvious fix to all this is to work to minimize or solve these cognitive and interpretive errors. Okay? One thing you might do to do that is to have some simple rules of thumb or things that should be assumed, right? And again, going back to what Amelia was saying earlier about a 2-to-1 merger being anti-competitive, you probably shouldn't have to prove that anew every time, right? But another approach is to have better analysis and more of it so that we bypass the disagreement on thresholds and on posterior probabilities. Okay, so what would some presumptions be? Well, again, I'm not going to try, I haven't tried to phrase these precisely, but some simple presumptions might be for horizontal mergers. When you have a big diversion ratio, there's a case to be answered, right? Now, how strong a presumption you take that you get, that's a difficult question, but at least it gets the discussion started on the right footing. In US merger control law, we have a concentration-based presumption, which is sort of similar, but it requires you to go through what was intended to be a simple test having to do with concentration, but has become a very complex test because you need to do market definition first. And anytime you need to do market definition, there's scope for a lot of confusion. Raising rivals' costs, exclusivity, taxing trades with the dominant firm's rival. These are basically vertical restraint issues. It seems to me if you have a dominant firm doing something that discourages trading partners from trading with the dominant firm's rivals over an extent of trade that's competitively significant, whatever that means, try to say it in a way that doesn't involve defining a market, preferably. That, again, should be a case to answer. Or when it comes to agreements, agreements on any topic, really, among a set of rivals whose merger would be concerning. That tells you collective market power of some kind, should be looked at hard, right? Now, you spent some time in the first panel talking about agreements that are purely beneficial. That's fine, right? So those would overturn any such presumption. But it seems to me there's an irresistible or nearly irresistible temptation if you get such a large set of rivals together, crafting agreements among themselves, as again Amelia said, I think, and Lars-Hendrik said, there's a temptation to throw in some anti-competitive benefits as well as the competitive ones. I put at the bottom of the slide here, e.g. pay for delay. So you can have efficiency benefits of settling litigation over patent validity, but as soon as you start having rivals, competitively significant rivals, craft those agreements, you've got a temptation for bad stuff to happen. So that was about 3 minutes on simple presumptions. I will say again, that wasn't my attempt at precise formulation, but something along those lines could help get us out of the situation where you have a demand for very detailed analysis that can't really be done, and a risk of inferences from that situation to the idea that there's not a problem. And it seems to me that that's one of the pitfalls that we may be in, and just saying let's have more vigorous policy is not really going to be a very good solution to that. We need a combination, I think, of laying out some simple presumptions, rules of thumb, meanings almost of the competition statutes, combined with taking detailed analysis seriously, but not falling into the CSI effect trap. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Mike. Do you agree?
I know this is going to disappoint you, Alena. Actually, I do agree with most of that. Look, first of all, thank you very much to E.CA for the invitation, and I echo Amelia's comment that more competition is always better, so it's good to see another consultancy based in London. Usual caveat, this is me speaking, not the CMA, but actually I'm not going to say anything controversial. So if you think I have said anything controversial, you've misheard. And I'm not going to comment on the experience in the US or difficulties of dealing with impossible judges. I'm going to be providing a UK perspective on this issue, and partly an EU perspective, but obviously, my job is within the UK. So, polarisation of antitrust. Look, I think antitrust has become polarised, and I think it's become polarised between those who think that antitrust competition law over the last 20 years has under-enforced to some extent, and those who continue to, who don't believe that to be the case. Now, I'm in the under-enforcement camp. I think there has been under-enforcement, and I think I don't believe that just because I'm now an enforcer. You can go back to stuff I wrote in 2006, when the Commission was looking at what was then Article 82, and I was saying, look, we're under-enforcing then, and that's still the case. I thought Article 102 was broken in 2006. It's still broken. So I'm not going to talk about why I believe that the evidence for under-enforcement. I want to talk instead about what I think causes it, and I think I'm going to talk really about 3 causes, I think, for under-enforcement, all of which are extremely solvable or curable. And I'm explicitly not going to argue the threshold should be changed or anything like that. I'm quite happy with how the law is. This is all about actually how we implement it. Okay, so what are these 3 things? I think they are the mistreatment of uncertainty, and that goes to some of what Joe's been talking about. A failure to appreciate the link between innovation and competition, and the importance of competition for generating innovation and dynamic efficiency, and also the downplaying of the importance of thinking about the incentives of firms and treating that as evidence. So it may not be in the docs, but why we should treat that as evidence. Okay, so let's start off with uncertainty. In the UK, and I think it's also true in the EU, uncertainty has historically been used as a reason not to intervene. So if things are a bit uncertain, then you let the dominant firm off. If things are a bit uncertain, then you clear the merger. And that seems to me just to be plain wrong. And if we think about this in the merger context, so the merger test in the UK is, will this merger lead to a substantial lessening of competition on the balance of probabilities? So that's very clear, 50-50 threshold. Okay? Now that means, however uncertain we are about a merger, we still have to work out where we are, to be technical, on the probability distribution function. We may be really uncertain about the effects of this merger. There may be very wide confidence intervals, anything we could do. We still have to work out whether we are more than 50% sure that it'll be bad, or whether we're more than 50% sure that it will be benign. And the idea that when it's all uncertain, you just throw up your hands and say, yeah, it's all too difficult, okay, we'll allow that merger. As I say that, that's obviously the wrong approach. I think it's obviously the wrong approach, but I do think it's an approach that has infected decision makers in the UK and I'm sure also in the EU. And certainly in the UK, we've made a big effort to try and move away from this. If you look at our merger assessment guidelines that we rewrote and reissued last year, we focus particularly on this point. I think it's really important. I should just add here, as an economist, and this is really going to rile the lawyers, as an economist, when people tell me, yes, I know it's 50-50, but look, the burden of proof is on the authorities, I just don't understand what that means. 50-50 is a symmetric standard. Burden of proof is not a symmetric standard. So I'd love a lawyer to explain to me why you can have a burden of proof on the enforcer under a 50-50 standard, because I don't understand it. Okay, so that's the first point. The first reason I think we've seen under-enforcement, and that's very curable. You just treat uncertainty properly in some of the ways that Joe was talking about. Okay, second thing I think that has been leading to under-enforcement is, particularly in digital markets, but not only in digital markets, is this idea that intervention or enforcement damages innovation. That is a line, certainly in the UK, it's a line that's pushed by think tanks such as the IEA, but it's also pushed by some serious thinkers who argue that actually enforcement, particularly in the digital sphere, damages innovation incentives. Again, that just seems to me to be wrong. I mean, my reading of the economic literature is that Arrow won the argument, to the extent there was an argument between Arrow and Schumpeter. Arrow won the argument, it is competition that drives innovation. Sure, you want to innovate in order to get the monopoly profits, that's the Schumpeter bit, but it's competition that drives innovation. And I'm not going to go into literature on that, but a really good article on this is Carl Shapiro's article from I think 2012 on which is called something like Competition and Innovation, Did Arrow Hit the Bullseye, which just lays this out very nicely. So, competition drives innovation. We know from the empirical literature there's pretty good evidence from an inverted U relationship between concentration and innovation. So at low levels of, at high levels of concentration, you get low levels of innovation. Then as concentration declines, you get high levels of innovation. And sure, at some point you may go over the hump and start going down the other side. But the levels of concentration that competition authorities are concerned with, seems to me we're on the upward sloping bit, whereby reducing concentration increases innovation. And I think, and given the importance of innovation and dynamic efficiency to the economy and to consumer welfare and to economic growth, it's really important that we get that. And a failure to appreciate that, I think, has led to some under-enforcement. Okay, final one of my three things is about incentives. Okay. I think non-economists, particularly non-economist decision makers, tend to undervalue the evidential strength of incentives, which is, okay, where's your theory of harm in the documents? If it's not in the documents, then you've got an uphill battle, even if the incentives are quite clear for how the firm will act after the merger, or why the firms are acting in an exclusionary manner. And of course, actually, most of the time, we do this without noticing. I mean, all Joe's stuff on UPP, which is fantastic innovation, it's all about incentives. That's all it is. Think about what the incentives of the firms are. But when you come to cases, I think we have put too much emphasis sometimes on, can I find a theory of harm in the documents, rather than what are the incentives of firms. Okay? And certainly, if it's in the documents, well, and I'll go a bit further. Sometimes you can find stuff in the documents which is incompatible with the incentives of the firms. And at that point, you don't just say, oh, okay, my incentives are irrelevant, I go with the documents. At that point, you've got to think about, try to understand what the documents are saying, because, firms are sophisticated. I'll leave it at that, on that bit. Okay, I'm going to speak for about 3 or 4 more minutes, and I'll be quiet. One thing that isn't the problem, I think, is a consumer welfare standard. Even though we quite often hear people saying, problem under enforcement has been caused by an adherence to consumer welfare standard. I really don't believe that. There seem to be 2 strands to this argument. One is consumer welfare standard is just about prices. Well, no, it's obviously not just about prices. It's much more about dynamic efficiency. Okay, dealt with that. The other is the argument that the problem with consumer welfare standard is it misses out important stuff. So it misses out labour market concerns. It misses out concerns about net zero. It misses out concerns about democracy. Okay, so we had a bit of a discussion about that in the first half. Those are all perfectly reasonable things to be worried about, but at the moment, they are not what the law says competition policy should care about. And absolutely, if a government wants to turn around and say to CMA, look, you should really care about net zero concerns, even when they're not driven by competition. So you should put net zero above competition. Fine, they can do that. But that's actually not what's been done at the moment. And so at the moment, we should focus on what the task we've been given. And it was, as Lars-Hendrik mentioned, the Tinbergen critique, one tool for one policy aim. Okay? And it seems to me that critique of the consumer welfare standard seems to me is not a good one, and certainly isn't the cause of under-enforcement. Okay, which brings me, in the last 2 minutes, to Joe's comments about vigour and rigour, which I largely agree. Rigor, I think, can be the enemy of vigour when it leads to decisions taking so long that they cease to be relevant. So I think this is much more of a problem in non-merger cases than in merger cases. So I remember years ago working on a case where I worked for a complainant and we won the case and the commission found against the dominant firm, and then it went to appeal and it went to another appeal, and by the time it got to that point, my client didn't care anymore. That client had had a market entry opportunity which the behaviour of the dominant firm had removed, and that had gone. And by the time it gets to appeal 10 years later, why would they care? Okay, so that's a point where apparent vigour and being really careful about all the facts and going through all the possible theories of harm actually is contrary to rigour. Actually, rigour contrary to vigour. And I completely agree with Joe. Actually, it's not that difficult to provide some pretty simple rules which are based on rigorous economic learning and which are very implementable. I mean, a Reader-Turner rule for predation strikes me that's been pretty successful. I don't think anybody seriously argues that's a bad rule. I think rules against raising rivals' costs, I'm on record multiple times saying that I think there are some rebate schemes that are just anti-competitive per se and by design. I don't have any problem with saying we should just impose those rules. Agreements that are used between firms as a substitute for a bad merger, okay, that seems again obviously to be a problem. So I think it is actually, there are a bunch of fairly simple rules we could put in place to improve the vigour of competition policy enforcement without losing the rigour, because they're going to be based on what economics already tells us. Okay, so just to sum up, look, there's obviously an active debate on under-enforcement. I think there's a number of current and historic behaviours of decision makers and competition authorities that mean we shouldn't be surprised about under-enforcement, which is mistreatment of risk, failure to understand the importance of competition for dynamic efficiency, and a failure to really appreciate the power of thinking about incentives. Okay? I don't want simple rules for the sake of it. They need to be based on good economic experience, but ideally I do want simple rules because I don't want to be part of a profession that creates complexity in order to make it impossible to enforce competition law. I want to be part of a profession which really adheres to the idea that clarity is what economics can bring to cases. Thank you.
Thank you. So before I open to the questions, what I'm taking from you that you are sitting at the same end of the boat. There is under-enforcement. So you failed to disagree. One thing that I do find very interesting is that the economic profession was the profession that was advocating for the rule of reason, so away from simple rules. So some 10, 15 years ago, we were the champions.
Sorry, I'm going to stop you. I just don't agree. I'm going to go back. 2006, Nelly Cruz stands up and says, we need more economics in Article 82, as it then was. I was certainly, and I wasn't on my own, amongst economists saying, no, we don't need more economics. We need some decisions. That was 3 years after the Intel case had started and 15 years before it ended.
Excellent. So I will open on that note a conversation. Who wants to disagree?
Not disagree. Let's throw in a question. Philip Girardi from Wilkie. No, very, very interesting thoughts, and obviously a fair amount of controversial stuff, I guess, at the moment when you're looking at it sort of from the private practitioner side, because I think the experience is somewhat different, I guess, when you're on the other side of the fence. What I found interesting, just two brief comments, is this challenge of too much information. And I think there's a sense on, I guess, the private practitioner side in merger investigations, perhaps in the UK more than in the EU, of course, that you do not actually get a lot of information. So there seems to be a bit of an information asymmetry in the sense of how much information is disclosed to the merger parties in the review. So it's just an observation in terms of, is there too much information, which perhaps confuses? Sometimes the sense is there isn't. One question which I thought is sort of I find very interesting at the moment is the role of market definition or frame of reference for the purpose of a sound analysis. And market definitions had a bad rap and has been demoted in the guidance somewhat. The term has been replaced with a reference to frame of reference. We have some recent tribunal judgments which emphasize the importance of a clear and precise frame of reference, which will influence the entire analysis, and perhaps a de-emphasizing of frame of reference or market definition by economists. And Joe, you, I think, said very briefly, was an interesting comment, is when market definition comes into the picture, things get confusing. And I'd be very interested just in some thoughts on the role of frame of reference for the purposes of merger analysis.
So let me say a little bit about that. I think there are two ideas that collide in the case of market definition in many interesting markets. One is that you should be just pulling together a set of substitutes sufficiently broad that a hypothetical monopolist would want to do some mischief. And another is you want to include in your market definition enough to be a frame of reference, not using that term in a non-technical sort of way, everything that you're going to be centrally talking about. And in particular, you know, if you have important complements that play a role in the market, do you include those in the market? Well, if you do, then that demolishes the role of market share as a proxy for substitutability. But if you don't, then people complain that you haven't included everything in your frame of reference. And, you know, I think it's perfectly possible to do both of those pieces of analysis, but you shouldn't give them the same name because they're sort of different.
Okay. Well, okay, so I'll start off slightly frivolous comment. Of course, the CAT has told us recently that market definition is not a question for economists. They explicitly said that in the compare the market judgment. So, you know, I'm probably, in fact, even said not a question for expert economists. Amateur ones, well, they're up for it. Look, I mean, you're right. We have downgraded the role of market definition in the recent mags. So my view is, and has been for a long time, that when the outcome of a case is dependent on an argument about a controversial market definition, then that case is in the wrong place. Because what you should be doing is looking more directly at the competitive effects of, let's say, that merger. Look at the competitive effects of that merger rather than, you know, trying to satisfy the hypothetical monopolist test. Okay? So that's the sense in which I think we have downgraded market definition, to avoid those places where a focus on market definition stops you actually really looking at the competitive effects analysis. It's particularly important in differentiated product markets, but I think it's actually true in all markets.
I have a slogan on this. Market definition is useful if and only if it's easy.
Yeah.
When it's difficult, it just leads to confusion.
I think that's spot on. Yeah.
I'm not sure the European courts agree, but...
Is the question, just want to follow up, is the question of substitutes and complements key for that analysis?
Well, I think, you know, again, if you want to say, here's all the firms that I'm going to be talking about in my competitive analysis and their products and how those influence pricing incentives, and complements can be very important for pricing incentives, that's fine. And that's a kind of, what am I going to be talking about? That's not a collection of stuff within which you should really be calculating market shares, because calculating market shares, to the extent that it's used in a Philadelphia National Bank or similar presumption or inference, is really about substitutability. And so, again, you're doing two different things, and they're both worth doing, or can be, but they're not the same thing.
Okay. Maurits, you wanted to ask a question, and then we have Tommaso.
Would somebody else want to go first? Because I don't want to. Well, so I have sympathy for the idea that simplicity is the hallmark of truth. And I have a case where a client was kicked out of a market in 2007. The case is still on appeal to the General Court. The damage litigation is stayed. because somebody has got to pay for the funeral of the client, and it will probably be paid when I'm dead too. So I sympathize with, but are we going too far? Because the pendulum tends to swing, and when it swings, it doesn't stop at the middle where there's a reasonable balance, it goes too far. Two examples. One, potentially in merger control. Now apparently there is a movement that says, in particular in the US, but also in Europe, vertical mergers are bad, conglomerate mergers are bad. What about Mr. Cournot in his 19th century thinking? And so in a 50-50 kind of case where you can't really prove, shouldn't there be a presumption that vertical mergers or conglomerate mergers of complements where their efficiencies are created, that they are, then in that case it should be allowed? If it's, and second, on the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, it's a prime example of this simplification of rules, and the rules are written such that even no defense is allowed, no proportionality defense is. You cannot invoke a justification for a number of the so-called abuses in Article 5 and Article 6. So, is that not another example where the pendulum swings too far?
So on vertical mergers, you know, the Cournot effect, Cournot complements effect, it's, you know, a lot of the vertical stuff was developed by and in response to the Chicago School, obviously not Cournot, but my view on a lot of what Chicago has had to say about vertical relations and vertical restraints is it's what I call a challenge question. It really ought to make you think. And so if you're concerned about a vertical merger, you need to think about the Cournot complements issue and why that's overcome by something else that you're concerned about. I don't believe the Chicago arguments are convincing if they're read as saying this is going to be good for sure, but I think they are convincing enough if they're read as saying you need to think about this. So that's kind of my approach on that. I don't think anyone says all vertical mergers are necessarily bad. I think there's a reaction to perhaps overly quick and dispositive use of the Cournot complements or elimination of double marginalization issue, which I think is very much along the lines of what I was saying, that it's something you need to think about. It's part of the effect. But it's not the whole story, and you might reasonably be concerned about other things going on.
Mike.
Yeah. So, I mean, on vertical mergers, I completely agree with Joe. You know, I'm not changing the way I teach students about the importance of thinking about complementarity when you think about vertical mergers. Of course, that's a really important part of the analysis. And in vertical mergers, the products are typically complements, and that's different from them being substitutes in horizontal mergers. I mean, that's economics 101. So I don't think anybody's going to move away from that. But that doesn't therefore mean all vertical mergers are good. It's something you take into account and you think about. On the DMA and simple rules, I don't particularly have a view, or say a public view, as to whether those rules are good or bad. But I think I would just say they're very different types of rules from the ones that I think we were talking about. We were talking about rules that are based on fairly well-established economic experience. The DMA rules, as I understand them, are largely based on a bunch of cases the Commission would like to take under 102, but that's all too difficult. We'll do them under the DMA. I think those are very different types of rules.
Okay, Tommaso.
So the previous comment on the vertical mergers is a little bit of a distortion of the current practice, because currently we have an almost presumption of efficiency in the vertical mergers. So to hear that now we want to reverse that and say that all vertical mergers are wrong, that this is a misrepresentation that people are trying to bring into the antitrust circle, that there are trade-offs. There is a reduction of double marginalization, but there's also incentive to foreclose. So we want to bring back economics into that analysis rather than to block every single vertical merger. That's clearly well aware. So I think it's important. Again, we want to celebrate E.CA economics, but we also want to self-reflect on what economics has been doing over the past 25 years. So my take on this is that there is imperfect but aggregate evidence which is all pointing in the same direction. So we saw margins going up And they're going up precisely among those firms that the enforcers are typically dealing with, so firms with market power. We saw industrial concentration going up. Sure, the data are imprecise, these are not antitrust market, but a data set of antitrust market doesn't exist. So we have to take the best information we have in front of us. We have seen also evidence that, which is the most worrying one, that dynamism is actually going down over time, both in the US and in Europe, which is very worrying. So all the evidence points in the same direction. And this has happened, and we have to also do some soul searching, precisely when we have used more economics into antitrust. So there is a coincidence, a correlation, causation, I don't know, no one is going to establish that, but this is coming along as we use more economics. To me, data are important. If I think of the US, 20 years ago, the DOJ was, challenging about 170 mergers per year, and now it's about 70 per year. If I think about the E.CA, over the past 30 years, the European Commission has blocked on average 1 merger per year. Okay? 1. These are numbers. Again, we can say what the numbers, and just to give you an example, I think touch reality number. In Europe, every year there are about 15,000 mergers, of which about 450 are notified to the E.CA. Of those, about 400 go through a quick procedure, which is a tick-boxing exercise with no economics. About 30, 40 go into some kind of analysis. And as I said, most of them are approved, some remedies, and 1 on average is blocked per year. So that's where we are. So I think those numbers are not good numbers, if you have to ask me as an economist. I mean, do we want to face numbers or not? So that's where we are. So this is where I want to reflect that most people have been disconcerted about that, and they got disillusioned about the use of economics in practice, not from academia, not from our models, but the way economics has been also. You talk about incentives, but the incentives are very clear. There's lots of money on one side, which are these big companies that want to merge, and enforcers have resources, but limited. And also the incentives they respond to, they are motivated, there's self-motivation, there's lots of things, but it's not really money which is driving the enforcers for sure. And money is very asymmetrically distributed. So that's where the business model is. This has created disconcern, and also, how can I say, people are not keen enough. Outside this circle, people are saying perhaps we shouldn't trust economists any longer, because that's the result of that we have achieved, and therefore the burden of proof is on us as economists to do good analysis to prove that we can still do good enforcement doing good economics. But it's difficult because the market forces are driving in certain directions. So this is where perhaps, since I have to disagree, I disagree with Mike when he says, I don't think that consumer welfare is an issue. Because I understand and we feel that in principle, of course, consumer surplus will be about prices and quality and choice and investment and all that stuff. But when we try to do something at the Commission, the Google shopping cases was about choice. What is that? Again, you guys, I'm talking about the antitrust elite would come to us. How do you measure that? How do you measure choice? We try to do innovation. We did, Dow DuPont, Bayer Monsanto. You know the attacks that we got on those cases, to the extent that the Commission has not run another case based on innovation any longer because they got burned on those criticism. Of course, I will defend those cases because I was involved. So anytime you try to do something within the strict domain of the consumer welfare standard, it's impossible to move the dial because anything is like an uphill battle that is endless. And you don't have resources. You don't have the resources, so in principle, again, it's great to say every case on its own basis, on its own merit. It doesn't work like that. You cannot find 100 battles at the same time. You choose, you pick a few, which is an area of agreement I have with Joe. We really need, with good economic work, bring back some presumptions, because that's the only way. So you're talking about market definition, but that's exactly the wrong way of spending limited resources of an enforcer. This is really where you spend most of the battle up front, and to prove that Google is dominant, to prove that Facebook is dominant, to prove that Amazon is dominant. Do we need to do that? And we never go on the meat of the case, which is where the harm might be, what is it. So, to me, I would just add to your idea, Joe, I would call it rebuttable structural presumption that should come back, because using also economics argument, The enforcers have no idea about what these firms are going to do into the future. The firms have information about what they're going to do, so let's give, I will have my structural presumptions. We've got no burden of proof on what is the relevant market. It can be some size, some metrics. Every metric is going to be imperfect. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But let's lower the bar for the enforcers, and then I throw the ball into the camp of those firms who have the right information. It's in their hands to prove that they need that merger, they need that behavioral stuff, etc., and they prove to us, to you, because I'm not the enforcer, obviously, any longer, and they prove to you that they really need that merger with merger-specific thing, etc., to do something which is good for consumers. And so the debate becomes focused on the meat of the case instead of having this endless discussion, which are just, as I said, burning resources in a very inefficient way.
Super. So actually, you appeared to furiously agree at the end.
On many subjects. So on the role of economists in getting us into parts of this mess, I mean, you mentioned a merger policy. In the US, so I think the most directly on-point evidence, more so than the items you mentioned, about merger policy having become unduly weak is the merger retrospectives literature. And that, with a couple of exceptions, was started at the Federal Trade Commission with the retrospective studies of hospital mergers. Hospital mergers went through, and the DOJ and FTC kind of lost willingness to challenge them after losing a string of cases. And the cases got lost on two grounds. Number one was market definition, particularly geographic market definition, where it wasn't so much a matter of being confused, it was a matter of the courts being convinced to apply a very, very broad geographic market definition that simply wasn't consistent with the facts. And the other reason was a fair number of these hospitals or hospital chains are nonprofits, some of them religiously run, and the executives would come into court and say, all this stuff about incentives is not true. Maybe it would be for profit maximizing firms, but we're just trying to do a better job for the patients. And the courts were unduly persuaded that the incentives were not evidence and that the testimony of the executives was. So I actually don't think that economists had a blameworthy role in that. Now, maybe that's focusing too much on that one area, but I think, well, let me leave it at that. Sorry, Mike,
Okay.
you were about to say something.
On that particular note, please allow me. Oh. Well, I think we need to allow Mike to catch a train, I'm afraid. But on that note, allow me to close our panel and to hand over to actually you, Rainer, and to Hans to say a few words.
This is what I wanted to push back a little bit, to be honest.
And to use the power of Mike.
Yeah, wonderful. I think that's a heartbreak a little bit after this critical words about economic antitrust consulting, and then celebrating the opening of our office. Thanks, Tommaso, for that. But still, we saw it could be somehow entertaining for you to learn a little bit about where E.CA started. So, Rainer, you as one of the founders, how did we start this business?
Well, I'm not going to reveal all secrets. Some of the roots go back further than where I will start. But here, one starting point is very close to DG Comp, Rue Joseph II, in a Tunisian restaurant where Hans and I met and discussed how to move forward, keeping the third key person, who's sitting here, a little bit at a distance, given his role as chief economist. So we were preparing the ground. And we called it even Tunisian talks. So it was a conspiracy. We believe, picking up on the first panel, that I was hopefully a conspiracy to the good of consumer welfare in the end. We had very little market power at that particular stage, but we are continuously aiming to get there, right? I mean, that also needs to be said. So it was discussions. There was no smoke in the room, but there was a serious talk about Alexis, where is he? Business plans and also how to enter the market and how to position ourselves.
And the strategy was clear. We wanted to become one of the tier one economic consultancy rooted in Germany and applying Anglo-Saxon type of economics. So we wanted to do the cool stuff, London style. This merger analysis based on a back-on-the-envelope type of calculation, as we have learned in Mike Walker's and Simon Bishop's book. We wanted to do this intuitive storytelling and relevant policy advice, as nowadays, Amelia, you are a champion of. And we wanted to do this rigorous empirical analysis. Lars-Hendrik, listen, rigorous empirical analysis, as you have taught us, and wanted to apply it to cases. So that was our aim, and we wanted to reach that with an intrinsically motivated team of IO economists.
Indeed. 15 years, steady growth. I think we are looking back on a very good history with the help from Hendrik. We've now grown to 50 economists. We've 9 directors, and we are super proud to now serve London, not just from the continent, our offices there, but also from our office here. We have as a slogan research-based consulting, and we put a lot of emphasis on how we operate within the firm, that we keep people learning and keep people really excelling in their job. And we work a lot with academics to achieve that. And we cooperate with our colleagues in the United States, Bates White. And Joe, you've been here, you've been presenting, but there are others here. There's Rachel, there's Eric, and there's, of course, the Bates in Bates White. And Charlie will, and this is a piece of advertisement, and I wholeheartedly recommend to see Charlie in a breakfast talk tomorrow morning at the Net. Breakfast talk tomorrow morning at the Net. Charlie Bates.
At 8:30, is that true? Charlie, not sure about that. Well, and the entry strategy, I mean, that worked out. And actually, we are pretty proud about our rather balanced case portfolio. So we do a lot of merger works. Currently, Alena, we are running one of the phase 2 mergers in front of the European Commission. Actually, it's about geographic market definition, and let's hope that we are doing good economics. We have a big portfolio also of administrative proceeding cases, working in the digital world for Apple, but also for BMW in cases. And we do a lot of litigation work. Some of the earlier cases, actually, we did with Bates White, and I don't know if some of you remember the ESBR-BR litigation, which was brought here in the UK, and we did it together with our colleagues here from Bates White. And most recently, we were also moving into governmental studies, and one of those was for the CMA. Alena was together with Bas here heading this effort, but also a lot of studies which we're currently doing for the European Union, specifically in the field of state aid.
Good. With that, I think you will say the last words, but the second last words is we will go on to celebrate, and we're celebrating a staff of 7 that are part of our approach to have a one-firm policy with all the 50. And that's next step. But before that, we say thank you. And you
to Alena and Bas for building that office so quickly. As you said, 7 people on the ground. with a lot of ambition. So thanks a lot for your hard work, but also the enthusiasm you're bringing and delivering to the team. So let's hope for a bright future, I guess, for E.CA economics. But if I hear us talking, hopefully also a bright future for antitrust economics, finding the right balance between simple presumptions and an effects-based analysis. So thank you all of you for being here and celebrating this office opening with us.
Thanks a lot.
Alena, were there some administrative stuff to be said, or was it just go to your drinks?
We need. So that's the only administration.
Okay.